There is a very dark and very cool version of the Catholic Holy Trinity hidden within the magic and the world building of George R. R. Martin's world and the old ways, and it hasn't really been talked about until now. Many of the recent videos I've done on the channel were build up to talk about this idea, but if you haven't seen them, don't worry, it's your lucky day. You can go and check them out after this and they'll make sense in either order. In the very last video, we talked about the idea that only death may pay for life, and that essentially all magic has a price, that price is all using the same currency, and we broke down how, therefore, all of these branches of magic are seemingly different branches off of the exact same type of magic. They are all separate, yet one. We further discussed how green magic seems to be the life creation magic of this universe, and how essentially life is the currency for all other magic, so therefore you can kind of look at all of the branches of magic as either life magic or green magic, depending on which word you want to use, but that is the green creation magic, which seems to be up at the top of all of the different branches of magic. We talked about how blood magic is seemingly using this original green magic power source and sacrificing it to do different spells and different sorts of magic. Therefore, blood magic is a very obvious branch off of the original life magic. And then we talked about how shadow magic is seemingly cast from original sources of life and or cast from the idea of the Godhead itself. Melisandre gives credit to the gods and the Lord of Light for casting her shadows, and we have talked on this channel how it seems like the others, which are constantly described as white shadows or cold shadows, and make no prints on the snow, they move around silently like shadows, it seems very likely that they are in some way or another shadows cast from the weirwood. So then I left you all at the end of last episode with a little bit of an experiment to see if you would piece together the same imagery that I did when looking at this whole entire situation. We have a green life creation magic that is represented by green magic that is represented in its physical form by the weirwoods and the giant collective magical consciousness which seems to inhabit them. So this is your green magic in the system, and then strapped to the weirwoods you have people who are consciousness merged to the weirwoods, and they are the green seers. They are essentially half man, half divine, and they are strapped to a tree for essentially blood sacrifice. And then in the other corner you have the others, who are the shadows cast potentially from the green seers, potentially from the weirwoods themselves directly. In either case, they are a shadow out there in the world, enforcing the old ways, enforcing the will of the Godhead, and working potentially through the followers of the God to do so. Does this sound like anything to you? Once you know how this whole system works together, to me it just screams Dark Holy Trinity. You have these three different branches of magic that are separate yet one, that are very directly representative of the three aspects of the Holy Trinity, and they are even functioning within the religion and within the world building in a very similar way. The green magic weirwood godhead, whatever you want to call this consciousness that is the head of the old god's religion, it is not only green life creation magic brought into the world and made physical, but it also offers you heaven upon death. And if it is true that the others are cast from the weirwood and representative in some way of the Holy Spirit, then it is also the thing that is there promising you an icy hell if you should go against the will of the weirwoods. So you have the green magic godhead at the top that is offering you heaven and or hell, depending on how you behave, and then of course you have the person who is strapped to it. In this case, in our story, we have Bloodraven, and we have Bran, who is potentially going to be wed to the trees, and in the show we even saw the Night's King made when they were crucifying someone to a weirwood tree, essentially, and then shoving a knife through his heart. Again, you have the imagery of the man crucified to the tree to do blood magic. It's all right there. It is a dark interpretation of the Holy Trinity. And just so you don't think I'm crazy when I'm talking about how George has warped and twisted all of these real-world religions to make his religions, I'm going to let George explain it to you himself.
I take certain tenets of the religions, but then I I maybe take part of this and part of that, and I meld them together, and I think about it, and I add a few imaginative elements. But the faith of the seven is, very loosely modeled on the medieval Catholic Church, but again with different elements. I mean, of course, the Catholic Church, which I'm no longer a practicing Catholic, but that was how I was born and raised. Has the whole concept at the heart of it, Trinity, which was explained to me as, well, it's three, but it's also one. Which kids can never get. It's like, okay, we have three gods. No, you don't have three gods. You have one God. He has three, parts. Okay, so we don't have three. We just have one, right? It's like the shamrock. That was how, the three-leaf clover. So I did that, except I made it seven instead of three. I have the whole, well, we have seven gods. We have seven personas. So instead of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, we have Maiden, Mother, Crone, which of course I took from paganism as the traditional female thing. I kind of hobbled the male side together, and then I added the stranger as the god of death. So yeah, all the religions are based. This is my general philosophy, I think, for fantasy, is not to, base it in reality, but then get a little imaginative to it and rework the elements and put this with that and add your own touch to it. But the grounding it in reality, I think, gives it a certain verisimilitude and plausibility, where just entirely made up religions that are unconnected to anything, it's much more difficult to make them plausible.
Hey, thanks for the backup there, George. That's exactly what I was just telling them. So you can see how George is sort of using his fantasy sci-fi writer brain to pick apart these religions and just make them his own, but then also he sort of always grounds his magic in somewhat what he would at least consider realism, to try and make it so that it feels like it would actually work. So you can see how he's picking apart this Trinity and deciding, okay, how would you actually have a son who is both man and divine? Well, what if the divine was this hive mind that's all the people who have ever lived who are contained within a tree, and then you could strap the person up to the tree, sort of like Jesus was crucified, and then you could do a mind merge, and then all of a sudden you have a man who is 100% man, 100% divine, as Jesus is said to be, and there's George's sort of hard fantasy realistic version of God the Son, being used for blood sacrifice as a green seer strapped to the Weirwood system. And in a world that is very low fantasy, low magic, George likes to keep it as much that way as he can for a fantasy story. He has basically said you're not going to have the gods directly on screen, so how do you have God the Father? Well, you have it basically function as a world tree that is both a giant tree system that's all connected, but also a hive mind of the past humans who have ever lived that also sort of represents the Catholic heaven on some level. So yeah, it's all a somewhat grounded, in a way where you're never going to have a god appear on screen, version of how you would have God the Father. Then how do you build a horror, hard fantasy version of the Holy Ghost? Well, you mix them with aspects of the Fae, you make them icy spirit monsters, and you have them raise the dead, and suddenly you have a very scary and terrifying icy version of the Holy Ghost, functioning as a magical big bad to be looming over your story, but then it is also out there, essentially enforcing the will of the god, and it is working through the followers of God if it is indeed cast from the Green Seers, as we have speculated. Also worth noting, since we're talking about the idea of the others being cast from people strapped to the trees, I could also see a situation that would be pretty cool where there were people strapped to these trees against their will, and then used to cast others, so that, like, some of the others at the very least might be trying to bring down the wall to get to their own bodies to, like, free themselves from this eternal torment within the wall. I think that would be pretty compelling and pretty cool, but who knows. In any case, right, I'm up in the air on the motives and the means and the exact nature of how it was done, but I do really think that when you look at the others as shadows, you should be looking at shadow magic and its role in this dark trinity, and that kind of fits really well with what the others seem to be doing in the story, which is being out there working as the shadows that are seemingly enforcing the old ways and scaring everyone into following the Weirwoods. And just to quickly explain that, in case this is the first video of mine you've seen, one of the things that I've talked about a lot in this series is essentially the old ways are a giant system that ensures a ton of blood sacrifice to the weirwoods, and the entire reason for all of this, the entire reason anybody agrees to any of it, all stems back to the idea that they are so terrified of the others coming back that they are willing to do whatever it takes to keep them on the other side of the wall, and that includes basically being subjugated by these people who gain power from the weirwoods, and they do things like the first night and all sorts of horrible things, and they've subjugated the people for, thousands and thousands of years, far too long for feudal subjugation to realistically last, but the entire reason all of it does last that long is there's this incredible fear of the others hanging over everyone and stopping them from changing anything that they've been doing, all because they're terrified of what might happen. The only reason any of it has been allowed to change is because it happened so long ago. Finally, it's all being forgotten, and eventually, piece by piece, the pact and the old ways are being abandoned. The first night was ended a few hundred years ago. The blood sacrifice to the weirwoods has almost stopped completely at this point, and that's why the others are now more active and beginning to be able to get closer to the wall. At least that's what it seems like is what's going on. The others seemingly have gotten more active the more the pact has been broken. If you're new here and that's the type of thing that interests you, don't worry, there'll be a whole big playlist where I talk in more detail about it at the end of the video, and in fact, you're actually in the middle of that playlist right now. Now, the next thing that I do want to quickly do here is just establish the idea that religion and magic are basically the same thing, at least in Westeros, and generally when you're constructing a fantasy story, the two are going to be pretty much inseparable, with magic always being used to essentially prove that religion exists. So if you feel like I was making a bit of a leap linking branches of magic to religious symbolism, well, here is George explaining how the two are pretty much the same thing.
But you can't ignore religion. You have working magic. You have magic that demonstrably works, which would affect the religious feelings of many people, Even when I was a Catholic and going to catechism and I was being taught all these Catholic things, I would sort of say, Sister, why is it that all this walking on water and raising the dead and stuff took place like 2,000 years ago? Because if it took place now, I would be much more convinced. If I could see it on television, and I would become the most religious guy in the world if we could actually see someone raising the dead or, ascending to heaven or doing any of these things we read about in the Bible and other ancient religious texts. And in fantasy, that does happen here. People say, well, why are the Brotherhood Without Banners abandoning their own religion that they were raised with, the Seven, to follow Thoros of Myr and the Red Gods? Well, it's partly because they've seen him raise the dead. Not once, but several times. Yeah. That's persuasive. Yeah.
So George notes there that magic and religion in fantasy are pretty much going hand in hand. The idea of working magic would always be used as a proof for religion, and that is the case in his stories. The other thing that he mentions that I feel is relevant for what we're discussing is he talks about how the more effective the magic is, the more persuasive the religion is. And therefore, if you're going to have this religion that is powerful enough to hold people in fear and to lock society in place for thousands and thousands of years, well, it needs to be doing some very powerful magic. It is one thing to use the fear of God or the fear of the gods to unite a society, but if the fear of the gods is going to unite a feudal society and keep it in line for 10,000 years, well, that fear better be really, really terrifying. And the others are really, really terrifying. So now that we've laid out how the old ways are functioning as an even darker, an even bloodier, an even creepier version of the religion that our author was raised with and eventually grew up to abandon, well, that kind of fits pretty well with the idea that we've been talking about through this entire series, that our characters are going to grow up in this story of generational change and essentially change the world by abandoning the old ways. going through a rebirth of both their beliefs and the beliefs of the entire world, which they are going to lead into a new age. So if that is the case, it's very fitting that our author has hidden his own religion that he grew up to abandon deep within the old ways, which our main characters will grow up to eventually abandon. He is writing what he knows on an emotional level from the perspective of our characters, who are going to be growing up with a certain system of beliefs and then having to realize that that system of beliefs has some flaws and is causing some problems in the world, and that it needs to be changed. And they are going to go through that process both on a character level in their character development and their worldview, but also on a grand societal level and on a magical level with the whole giant world tree system that seems to be at the heart of controlling the magic of this world. And of course, just for some clarification, when I say the world tree in this series, I am talking about the heart trees. I'm talking about like the whole system of the heart trees that seem to be interconnected and functioning on a similar level to a world tree. But if I would say just heart tree, that has another like more commonly used meaning within the fandom, so that's why I'm saying world tree. Because still at this point in the general fandom, when you say heart tree, people would think like, oh, are you talking about like a single weirwood in a castle, the heart tree? But like, no, I think like the heart tree represents like a whole heart of the planet, a heartbeat of the planet, cycling the seasons, keeping the magic in balance, growth, all of that. The Summer King, the Winter King mythology, cycling of seasons, and nature magic is all tied into this whole heart tree system, as well as the Catholic Holy Trinity, because as George said earlier in one of those clips, he takes different pieces of all of these religions and magic, and he likes to mix them all together and create the coolest thing that he can. So now, just to let him drive home himself the point that I was talking about writing what he knows, and set up how he could be writing what he knows on an emotional level, about, again, losing your religion, losing your worldview, and you could sort of see how that process on a giant magical level could be played out as the death of an old system, a long night, followed by a rebirth of new ways. Well, to drive home how George likes to write what he knows on an emotional level, I'll let him explain that little bit of writing advice in his own words.
This is something always said to aspiring writers: write what you know. When I was a young writer, I hated hearing that because I didn't know anything, really. I was this kid from the projects in Bayonne, New Jersey. I had never gone anywhere, never had any money. I wanted to write fantasy and science fiction, but I'd certainly never seen a dragon. I'd never gone to another planet. I'd never done any of this stuff, so how could I write what I know? So I sort of rejected that. But later, and when I actually became a writer, I began to understand the truth of that. It's not writing what you know in terms of the care and raising of dragons, or it's writing the emotional truth of your own life, and whatever furniture you may put into your story, whether it's a far distant planet or a fantasy world, the core of it is still what you know in terms of emotional truth. That's what's going to make the characters come alive. That's what's going to make it real.
So when George talks about the idea of writing what you know on an emotional level, and when he talks in his outline that he gave to originally sell the books about how some of these characters are going to grow from children to adults and change the world in the process, and how this is a generational saga, these are the reasons that I've been saying this entire series that George is writing a story of generational change, a birth of new ways, a cycle of rebirth, ice and fire meeting to cause rebirth in the end times like in Norse mythology, mixed in a little bit with some Catholicism symbolism that he has built himself in a dark sort of critical version of the religion that he was raised with, and then he is building all of it into, as he described it, the furniture of a fantasy story of Westeros. Clips like what I showed you in George's own words are why I think that he is definitely writing the story of his own life and his own life experiences, growing up in a generation that wanted to see the world change, the many experiences that he and others had while trying to change the world, and the many things that he probably saw happen to people who did try to change the system, those are going to be things that are going to color his stories. So I think it's pretty reasonable to think that the idea of him losing his religion is another formative experience that he is going to have mirrored in his novels. But like he has said, with fantasy, you take it and you make it way bigger and more grand and more dramatic. So rather than him losing his worldview and his religion, it is going to be the entire culture of Westeros that is going to lose the old ways and the old gods in this cycle of rebirth. And that's going to be the giant fantasy version of what George went through himself. So whether you're on board for the cycle of rebirth or not, or whether you're on board with the general idea that the old ways are an issue and probably going away by the end of the story, hopefully I have made a compelling case that George has hidden a dark version of the Catholic Holy Trinity deep within the magic of the old ways, and hopefully now that gives some added context to a lot of the things that I've been talking about as to how this entire magic system seems to all function together. The Weirwoods, the blood sacrifice, the others, all of the old ways, they all seem to come together and form this giant functioning magical system. Hopefully you now feel like you have a better idea of how that entire system functions, some of the inspirations behind it, and how George likes to build systems like this. If you've made it this far into the video, hopefully you will like and subscribe before you go. There's a lot more to talk about that's going to be coming in future videos, and I'm sure this topic will be coming up again. But that's all I have for you today on the topic of the Dark Trinity that I see in the old ways of A Song of Ice and Fire. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you with something else very soon.